Over to you, Jeff.
Let's begin with some auspicious verses of salutation from Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle. Enthused by great compassion, you taught the immaculate Dharma to abandon all views. To you, the Buddha, Gautama, I pay homage. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th installment of the Jeffrey Hopkins Legacy Series with Professor John Powers. My name is Jeff Allen, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Buddhist Center, again, collaborating with Sravasti Abbey and Institute for Tibetan Studies. Any donations received during this series will go to Institute for Tibetan Studies. There will be a link in the chat box for donations. This will bring you to the Sravasti Abbey donation page. Write in the comments section when you make your donation, Jeffrey Hopkins Series, and this will help continue the internet availability of so many publications on the website, as well as providing funding for future translations. Professor Hopkins left because of impermanence, quite a few unfinished projects, and he worked right up until the end of his life. And as an aside, there's an updated version of the classic text we were just speaking about, Meditation on Emptiness, coming out in early 2025 from Wisdom Publications that Professor Hopkins worked on with an international team right up to before his passing. After the lecture, we'll entertain a few questions for around 30 minutes. Please post those in the link found also in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. Slides will be are available, and they're in the link, I think, attached, and you can find them also in the YouTube. There's a link, and they'll be later on the Sravasti Abbey website as well, I believe. So I am honored to introduce Professor John Powers, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. This title is given to the most influential humanities researchers and practitioners in Australia. Professor Powers completed his PhD under the supervision of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins in 1991 with his thesis on the Sandha-Nirmukana Sutra, called The Concept of the Ultimate in the Sandha-Nirmukana Sutra, or the Sutra Explaining the Thought. He has since published several books about the topic, and the sutra was taught in Vaishali, categorically fitting into the third turning of the Wheel of Dharma. You may be familiar with Bodhisattva Pramansamugata's questions to Buddha, found in Lama Tsongkhapa's The Essence of Eloquence, one of Gen Jeffrey's favorite Buddhist texts, and this interaction is from the Sutra Explaining the Thought. Professor Powers is mentioned in the preface of the first volume of the Essence of Eloquence series called Emptiness in the Mind-Only School of Buddhism by Professor Jeffrey Hopkins, where he says that the two of you read the Sutra Explaining the Thought together word by word for several years. So just a little history there. I was looking through that book and saw that in the beginning of it and wanted to mention it. Since graduating, he's lectured and taught in the US and Australia at various universities. Professor Powers held long-term faculty positions at Australian National University, Deakin University, and University of Melbourne. He is the author of 20 books and more than 100 academic articles and book chapters. Most of us have a copy of Introduction to Tibetan Buddhism on our shelves. Guilty. What a resource to help sort out the Tibetan Buddhist landscape out in words that didn't require another book to understand. This work still stands up as an incredible overview of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and we're very lucky Sidney Pilburn encouraged you to write it at the American Academy of Religion conference, and you accepted that. Professor Powers has traveled the Buddhist world and each time immersed himself in the local traditions. There are not many places that practice Buddhism that he has not been. All of this has been made possible because of funding from research grants and environmental projects that Professor Powers has spearheaded. He has successfully secured millions of dollars in grants for these extremely important projects. Very, very impressive. His academic interests are wide-ranging, including Yogacara, Madhyamika, Buddhist intellectual history, gender, meditation theory and practice, human rights, environmental issues, the Free Tibet movement, the use of propaganda, and the ever so elusive philosophical topic and engaged practice called haki. It's amazing and inspiring to look at your career and see how much one human can accomplish. I'm honored to introduce Professor John Powers to speak with us about the 8th and 9th Karmapas explanation of Madhyamaka and its necessity for Mahamudra. Over to you,
Thanks, Jeff.
Professor Powers.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, it was interesting as you were talking, you brought up a lot of fond memories of working with Jeffrey. When I first got to University of Virginia, I already had an MA in Indian philosophy. And most people in that program ended up getting assigned a topic by Jeffrey. But I already knew at the time that I wanted to work on the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra. So my first meeting with him, I think it was the second day after I got there, he asked me if I had an idea of what I wanted to do for a thesis. And I said, yeah, I want to work on the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra. And he said, do you have a copy? And I said, I do. He said, bring it tomorrow, we'll get started. And so pretty much every week after that, for at least one session, often two, we would read the sutra, line by line, word by word, discuss it. And then he also brought other people in to help me with that project. Christian Littner, for instance, came for a year, and we read every line of it together. And then Kensler Yeshe Thupten was there for a year, and we worked through commentaries on the essence of good explanations, like Shiningbo, which is primarily based on, as you said, the 7th chapter of the sutra. So I had a very intensive period of time working on that text and on its commentaries and on the literature associated with it. And all that was basically due to Jeffrey. So what I'm going to talk about today is a project that went on for about 6 years. It was funded by a research grant from the Australian Research Council, the ARC. And it had a really good group of people from all over the world, and with very diverse backgrounds and perspectives. So we had two traditionally trained Tibetan lamas, Geshe Yeshe Tapge and Khenpo Tashi Tsering. Geshe Tapge was the main expert at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies for Indian root text. And Tashi Tsering was the Khenpo, I think it may still be actually, the Khenpo of Sangha Studies at the Central Institute. And then there was Jay Garfield of Smith College and Harvard University. Guy Newland, sorry, not Guy Newland. I saw Guy Newland's name out there. Jed Foreman, Douglas Duckworth, Ryan Coughlin, Jose Cabazon, Thomas Doctor. It was a really good group of people. We all worked very well together, and we had meetings in various parts of the world, mostly in India, actually, at the Central Institute. And it was kind of in many ways a continuation or an extension of what I had done with Jeffrey. My first serious introduction to Madhyamaka came in Jeffrey's Madhyamaka seminar, which was my second year, I think, of graduate school. And I had never really looked at Madhyamaka much in depth. I was mainly working on Yogacara topics. And so we were basically exposed to a very Gelugpa-centric view of Madhyamaka. And there was really not even a sense that there was any other perspective on Madhyamaka. This was really presented as what Madhyamaka was. And along with that, we had a Sanskrit class where we read the fundamental verses on the middle way, the Madhyamaka Karakas. And so we had sort of a year of very intensive Madhyamaka studies. And after that, I didn't really do much with Madhyamaka until this project started. And it began with a conversation I had with Jay Garfield, where he was talking about an alternative perspective on Madhyamaka and a debate that started in Tibet in the 15th century and that went on for more than 5 centuries and involved many of Tibet's best minds for that time, and still continues today. It still has implications for intellectual debates among Tibetan intellectuals today. So when we started looking into the text, we realized that it was a really rich trove of materials and presented some really interesting issues related to Madhyamaka, how to understand Madhyamaka, how to interpret it. And I found that the most interesting one to me was the text written by the 9th Karmapa, Wangchuk Dorje, who took what I thought was a very extreme view of Madhyamaka, in which he said Madhyamaka has no opinions, it has no theses. It's basically just a corrective approach to philosophy in which Madhyamikas will take on other philosophies, other philosophers, and show the problems in their ideas, but without taking any position of their own. And this is very different from what I had seen with Tsongkhapa. So it was interesting to see this very different view. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to share my slides here, and hopefully that will go well. Yep, it's coming up. That's good. And one thing worth mentioning at the beginning is that the title, Madhyamika and Experience, summarizes one of the important aspects of this debate, that every member of everybody who participated in this debate cites meditative experience as the key to really understanding Madhyamika. That is, all of them agree that Madhyamika is not simply an intellectual endeavor, that it's something that requires that the person engaging in Madhyamika also have a high level of meditative experience. And that's what makes it possible to do Madhyamika effectively. And so all of them are basically saying that they have it and the others don't, which is kind of interesting to read. And we'll see how that works out as we go along. So the main focus of the debate is how to understand conventional truths and by implication, ultimate truths. So conventional truths, Samvrti Satya, Gunzok Demba in Tibetan, according to Tsongkhapa, can yield reliable knowledge. Now, conventional truths are things that are true on a conventional level. Okay, so like a table, for instance, is a conventional truth. It's a conventional truth, according to Tsongkhapa, in that it performs the functions of a table. So when you look to see what if it does what a table does, like I can put my computer on it, I can eat on it and things like that. And so therefore it is conventionally true. It's not ultimately true because when you examine it from the ultimate perspective, you realize that it's a collection of parts brought into being by causes and conditions. It changes in every moment. It will eventually disintegrate, pass away. And so it has no ultimate reality. And so there's nothing about it that persists even from one moment to the next. And so they appeared, though, to have inherent existence. That is, when we look at conventional truths, they appear to be inherently what they are, but this is false. So this is why Samvrti Satya is the term used for this. Samvrti means to cover something, or even to thoroughly cover something. So something that's obscure. So it is obscured. So it has the sense of an obscurational truth. Or a truth by convention, but not something that's ultimately true. Now, the person who started this debate was Daktsang Rinchen, you can see his dates there. He charged Tsongkhapa of being guilty of 18 great burdens of contradiction in his presentation of the true truth. Not surprisingly, that annoyed the Gelugpas significantly. The fifth Dalai Lama issued a call to his fellow Gelugpas to refute Daktsang and to show that he was wrong and that Tsongkhapa was right. And the first person who signed on to do this was the Panchen Lama Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, who wrote a short treatise in which he attempted to refute Daktsang. I personally don't think it was all that successful. He made some good points, but it was more invective and ridicule than real philosophy and really engaging with Daktsang's ideas. The next Gelugpa was Jamgyang Sheba, who basically didn't even bother to argue. He just basically insulted Daktsang for about 100 pages and said that he was on drugs and he was insane and stuff like that, and didn't really, and he accused Daktsang of holding positions that he never held, and that actually, in many cases, explicitly rejected. And then he said, see, you're contradicting yourself because you're holding this position that he didn't actually hold. So it was and Jeffrey translated this text, and he wrote in his, this is Maps of the Profound. He wrote that he thought that it was very unsuccessful and unsatisfying to read this text because it just goes on and on and on with this invective aimed at Daktsang, but it doesn't really engage with what Daktsang says. The next Gelugpa, the one who I think was the most successful, was Purchok or Porbuchok Ngawang Jamba, who wrote, I think, a very nuanced critique, a response to Daktsang. And if you're interested in what I think is probably the best Gelugpa version of Madhyamika, this is the one that I think is the best from what I've seen so far. And if you're interested, if you look at the books that we published from this study, it's called Knowing Illusion, published by Oxford University Press. And there are 2 volumes. And the first one is philosophical studies of this debate. And the second one is translations of the main texts involved. So now Daktsang said that the main thing for Daktsang is that we're talking about falsities, okay? So the conventional truth is not really true. It's overlaid by falsity because things on the conventional level appear as other than what they really are. And so from Daktsang's point of view, once you establish that we're talking about falsities here and that the entire conventional realm is overlaid by falsities, it's nonsensical to talk about true and false falsities. Tsongkhapa, however, thinks that it is possible to have justifiable knowledge, and we'll see how that works in a second. Now, one of the key debates here and one of the key issues is what Nagarjuna really meant when he claimed that he had no thesis. In replies to objections, he famously says, if I had any thesis, that error would apply to me. That is, he was being accused of contradictions by an opponent who says that his rejection of theses is itself a thesis. And Nagarjuna says, no, I'm not saying anything at all. He says, but I have no thesis, and so I do not have this fault. If I were to apprehend anything by means of perception and the other epistemic instruments, the pramanas or sema, then I would engage in affirmation or rejection. But because I do not do so, no such charge can be leveled against me. And this sounds pretty clear, right? He says, I have no thesis. Get over it. Many people, many interpreters have argued that he really does have a thesis, but he doesn't want to put it in words, or he has a thesis that is not about, he doesn't have an inherently existent thesis or a thesis about inherent existence. There's a whole range of ways of talking about this. But Nagarjuna himself actually says, I have no thesis. And as we'll see, the Karmapas, Mika Dorje and Wangchuk Dorje, take him at his word. That is, that he really meant that he literally has no thesis. The Gelugpas say that think differently. So what does Daktsang have to say? Well, the main text for this is his book, Freedom from Extremes, Accomplished Through Comprehensive Knowledge of Philosophy. This is a Drupta text, a text of philosophical tenets. And it looks at, as most of these texts do, it looks at philosophical schools as understood by Tibetan intellectuals. And the main source of controversy is the Madhyamika chapter. And in particular, the sections on Prasangika Madhyamaka, that is consequentialist Madhyamaka. Daktsang claims in several places in the text that he's the only person who has accurately interpreted Madhyamaka. Everybody else is wrong. Even the people who are sort of on his side, basically none of them got it right in the way Daktsang has. And one of the most important things that he says is that he rejects the whole idea of epistemology as having any relation to Madhyamaka. This is Pramanavada. This is particularly what's associated with Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who talk about the use of epistemic instruments or pramanas. Perception or inference are the ones that the Pramanavadins accept. Others will accept things like analogy or verbal testimony and things like that. Daktsang rejects all of these. Tsongkhapa does want to maintain pramanas for his philosophy, but what Daktsang says is that as soon as you start privileging certain means of epistemic access, like the pramanas, you were guilty of foundationalism. That is, these are things that are more true or more reliable than other things, according to the Pramanavadins. These are things that are they don't even think that they have to defend. Daktsang, however, says that pramanas and every other epistemic instrument, all of these things are merely human constructs. They don't have any truth value in and of themselves. And so we can use them in a transactional way on a day-to-day basis. But as soon as we start thinking of them as having a higher truth value, as being foundational, then we miss the whole point, and we're certainly not doing Madhyamaka. So here's Daktsang talking about Daktsang. I won't read the whole thing, but you can read this, and he's talking about how he's the only person who's figured out what the Buddha taught. Everybody else is wrong. And he says that looking at everybody else and how stupid they are makes him despondent. So he didn't have any problems with his own self-esteem. I like this. The sun of my discernment is indeed capable of illuminating all objects of knowledge, but should his light not fall on those who stay in caves facing north, then that is not the fault of the sun. Okay, so the 18 contradictions, this is the heart of the matter for Daktsang and the others who follow him. So again, as I mentioned, once you establish that the conventional is overlaid by falsity, then it's false. That's basically the end of the story. Now, another thing that's really important in this debate is that it also factors into how Buddhists perceive reality. And so according to Daktsang, Buddha's perceptions are free from error. And what that means is that Buddhas do not perceive the conventional, okay? And this is a really important point. This is one of the things that was scandalous to the Gelugpas, because for the Gelugpas, the main response, and you find this in Porchoke and also from the Panchen Lama, they said that what this would mean in practical terms is that Buddhas would be unable to perceive half of reality, that is the conventional truth. But what Daktsang says is that because Buddha's perceptions are free from error, because Buddhas see reality as it is, if they saw the conventional, then the conventional would be the ultimate, because that's what the Buddhas see. So Daktsang has no problem with the idea that Buddhas do not participate in conventional reality, that they don't see conventional reality. There are various ways of talking about how the Buddhas can actually, relate to sentient beings and everything. But the main point here, and the one that is most problematic for the Gelugpas, is that this would mean that Buddhas are in a sense, dissociated from the conventional and from the sentient beings who perceive it. And so then the question for the Gelugpas is, how do they relate to beings who operate on the mundane realm if they're not even seeing things that ordinary beings see? So in Madhyamika, truth and falsity are generally understood in terms of non-deceptiveness and deceptiveness. That is, the ultimate reality is, ultimate truth is non-deceptive. It exists in exactly the way that it appears. Conventional truths are deceptive because they appear to exist from their own side, to have inherent existence, but they don't. So for something to be true is for it to be non-deceptive. For it to be non-deceptive is for the mode of appearance and the mode of existence of the object to be concordant. To be false is to be deceptive, to not exist in the way that it appears. So this is the key debate here between the two sides. What does this mean? And is it possible to talk about truth and falsity on the conventional level? Again, the Gelugpas following Tsongkhapa say that it is. The Karmapas and Daktsang say that it isn't. So Samvrti Satya, conventional truth or relative truth, can mean truth by agreement, relative truth, or obscurational truth. But it's something that is viewed mistakenly. Its mode of appearance and its actual mode of subsistence are different. And because of that, it's deceptive. So this is one of the core debates between the two sides. Daktsang says that Tsongkhapa's positing a valid certification for obscurational truths would mean that they're established through their own power, suksudrupa. Suksudrupa implies stability or confidence. Something that has this can generate conviction. So like, for instance, when I reliably see something as a table and I confirm that it's a table and so forth over and over again, or when I see regularities like the sun coming up in one direction and things like that, I can have a justified confidence in this, even though I know that ultimately these things are conventionalities. And so Tsongkhapa says that when you conduct your investigation with stainless reasoning in accordance with valid evidence, confidence in your conclusions is justifiable. So he denies, by the way, that conventional truths are established through their own power. But Daktsang says that by establishing epistemic instruments, which he says are foundations, he has to agree that they're capable of generating this type of certainty. By the way, one of the things that we found as we were doing this is that although each side is using the same terms, they tend to be talking across each other. So they're using these terms in different ways, but not really engaging with how the other side is using them. We found that particularly with pramanas, that when one side talks about them, they're talking about them very differently from the other side. And so a lot of the debate going back and forth is kind of unsatisfying in that they're not really engaging with the other side very much. So all the people involved in this agree that Buddhas are omniscient. But Daktsang says that this doesn't mean that they participate in the perceptual mistakes of the obscurational. In other words, they only see ultimate truth. So their purview is free from any sort of error, any sort of illusion. And so when you talk about warrant or truth, this is merely conventional transaction. So again, he doesn't say that you can't make sense of conventional reality. He doesn't say that, for instance, you can't start a fire in the way that you have in the past, or that you can't cook your food and prepare things the way you have. You can on the conventional level do things that have established in the past work, but that doesn't mean that they have any ultimate justification. So the only truth the Madhyamika, when operating as Madhyamika, might acknowledge is ultimate emptiness. But even that is only something that operates on the conventional level. So when you're involved in emptiness, when you're directly perceiving emptiness, even that falls away. So ultimately, there's nothing that can be said on conventional level that is even remotely accurate with respect to the ultimate truth. So in other words, we get back to this idea of experience again. So Daktsang claims that the only way that you can really understand the ultimate truth is to directly experience the ultimate truth. And once you do that, all this argument about conventional ultimate justification, pramanas and so forth, all of this becomes worthless and irrelevant. So Wangchuk Dorje and Mika Dorje, these were the 8th and 9th Karmapas, as I mentioned. Now, they understand Madhyamaka as a thoroughgoing skepticism. Wangchuk Dorje's concise compendium in the middle way says the Madhyamikas, if they're consistent, deny everything, and they even reject denial. That is, they don't even say that their denial is a stance that they take. So they do not affirm or deny anything, at least when operating within Madhyamaka context. Again, that doesn't mean that they can't make a promise, that they can't say, I'm going to see you tomorrow, or they can't make food or start a fire or something like that. It just means that when they're thinking as a Madhyamaka and operating as Madhyamaka, they will avoid this sort of thing, that is trying to engage in affirmation or rejection. The other thing that comes along with this is that there is no wrong loop, no own system for Prasangika. Prasangika is merely an approach to philosophy that undermines the false understandings of others, but without trying to posit anything from your own side, or without taking any position. So one of the debates is, what is a thing, a vastu? And we translated this as proven entity. Jeffrey translated it as established base. This is something that is that's real from a conventional truth, something that exists as it exists on a conventional level. So he says it implies freedom from fabrications. That's prapancha. Does this also entail that such a thing is free from fabrications? Even if we use the copula is, we would only commit to an extreme position involving fabrications if we were to do so with conviction. If we were thereby unequivocally to decide in terms of our own system between something's existing or not, or as being this or that, or if we were to make a statement about a particular extreme's existence, or about as being this or that, simply saying that something is free from fabrications, however, does not amount to accepting a claim. In other words, they're not going to accept anything or reject anything. So this is the what they see as the Prasangika approach, Tengyur. It simply uses arguments to refute opponents to show where the opponents have gone wrong. It's a reductio ad absurdum approach where they draw out the unwanted consequences of the opponent's position, but without taking any response, without making any stance in response to that. And the opponents to them say that accuse them of bad philosophy or inconsistent philosophy. That is, that they're doing philosophy in bad faith. Other philosophers take out a position, they establish a set of tenets, and then they try to defend it. And what Daktsang is saying is the Prasangikas don't operate that way. They stand outside of this, and they merely sort of critique the others, but without trying to put forward anything of their own. So, that anything constitutes the Prasangika's own system would entail the truth of any random idea. That anything is a proven entity, a vastu, would entail the truth of any random idea. To be conventionally existent precludes being ultimately existent. So in other words, they're not taking any position on anything. Now, I won't read the whole thing here, but one thing that's important here is that Mika Dorje follows a division that's set up by Daktsang between 3 levels of analysis, which he thinks will help people to make sense of what he's saying. So you have the ordinary level, the level of ordinary people. This is the level of no analysis. Okay, so this is simply what ordinary people who haven't studied philosophy, how they see the world. Okay, they take things as real as they appear. They don't question them. The level of slight analysis is basically conventional Madhyamaka. So this is when you start analyzing things and you realize that there are conventional truths and ultimate truths. The conventional truths are false, that ultimate truths are basically come down to emptiness. But when you get to the third level, the level of beyond analysis, this is when you come to realize that even that falls apart through experience. That is, when you experience reality as it is, you realize that all of these conceptions, all of these ways of looking at things are merely done ultimately from the conventional point of view. So again, there is no prasangika view. And he says that some people say there's a Madhyamika view, but that doesn't mean that there actually is. And here we'll see how that plays out. So Wangchuk Dorje says, some may ask, I love this passage. He says, is Introduction to the Middle Way by Chandrakirti one of your school's texts or not? We don't assert anything. Is Introduction to the Middle Way acknowledged by others to be a Madhyamika text according to others? It is. In other words, sure, they say that. And who are those others? Mundane people who call Chandrakirti Prasangika Madhyamaka, and everyone else up to and including Swatantrikas, that is the other branch of Madhyamaka. But Wangchuk Dorje refuses to even acknowledge that Chandrakirti is a Madhyamaka. He says, sure, there are people who say that. That doesn't mean that I have to agree to it. Introduction to the Middle Way, the Madhyamaka Avatara. Sure, people say that's a Madhyamaka point of view. That's a Madhyamaka text, but that doesn't mean that I had to accept that. So people who say such things are merely others. They're not Madhyamakas. Someone who is a consistent Madhyamaka will realize that even something like referring to Chandrakirti as Madhyamaka, or even taking his works and Nagarjuna's works as Madhyamaka texts, is something that only operates on the conventional level and isn't Madhyamaka. That is, Madhyamakas don't take any position, even ones that seem so apparently obvious to most Madhyamakas or to most Buddhists. So, Wangchuk Dorje says, some might propose the following reductios. Because others say there is a Madhyamaka system, there is a Madhyamaka system. Or because others say that there is karmic causality, there is karmic causality. Now, this is pretty basic, right? Okay, karmic causality is in many ways the foundation of Buddhism. Wangchuk Dorje says, I'm not even accepting karmic causality. That is that, causes lead to effects, and that say positive actions lead to positive effects and they're part of the path. He rejects all of these sorts of things as operating simply on a conventional level. When you're operating as a Madhyamaka, even these sorts of things are merely conventionalities, and they're not things that Madhyamakas will assert. So he says, this appears to how we should formulate our response. So what the text is basically sort of teasing out the ramifications of what it would mean if you take this extreme response, this extreme interpretation of Nagarjuna. One that really, as we saw, follows his own words. Nagarjuna says straight out, I have no thesis. Chandrakirti in many places says exactly the same thing. He also says other things that suggest that he might, but these verses are the ones that are most important for Wangchuk Dorje and Miki Dorje. And these are the ones that they focus on as the types of things that they see as the final word of Nagarjuna. Now, another thing that's interesting is the way he writes the text. Much of it is written like a Tibetan philosophical debate. He poses questions, he cites texts, he gives responses and so forth. And the final part of the text is a lengthy, probably about 80 pages, collection of sources that he thinks help to solidify his perspective, things from sutras, things from philosophical texts, and so forth. And all of these he thinks are taking that same sort of point of view that he is, and that all back up his understanding of Madhyamaka. So, Miki Dorje, the notion of correctly assessing an illusory object is contradictory. It implicitly ascribes to the object aspects that are more than simply illusory. That is, once you establish that it's illusory, why would you think of correctly assessing it, aside from understanding it as illusory? So Gelugpa's, this is one of the places where they're speaking at odds. Gelugpas tend to speak of the world as being like an illusion, Gumatabu, rather than being an illusion. And the other side, that is Daktsang, his followers, and the two Karmapas talk about the illusory nature of this of the world. And this is what they really focus on, is the illusory aspect of things. So Gelugpas affirm the conventional truth of some appearances, that is, like waters being wet and fluid. These are things that are its characteristics. and deny others, like its appearance as being essentially wet, or that it exists the way that it appears. But they say that you can reliably understand water as being wet, and you can confirm this over and over and over again, which can give you justified confidence in the efficacy of water to, for instance, slake your thirst or to clean your home and things like that. So I don't think that I really need to do that. So what Mika George says is that as long as you continue to operate in this way, that is on the conventional level, as long as you continue to ascribe confidence to things like the essential wetness of water or the reliable wetness of water, you're never going to be able to escape cyclic existence. That is, you're always going to be mired in this illusion because you'll be taking the illusion seriously. You'll be operating within the illusory framework of the illusions. And so you'll never even be able to get out of cyclic existence, much less achieve the omniscience of a Buddha. Buddhas are completely beyond this sort of thing, have utterly transcended these sorts of ways of operating. Now, this is, again, this is one of the ways in which they talk about experience. So Mika Dorje says that those wishing to gain practical experience with the embodiment of truth, the Dharmakaya, the ultimate truth, and the intrinsic nature of all phenomena, must be able to gain concrete experience with the thoughts that are phenomena belonging to the relative truth. In other words, you examine relative truths, conventional truths, and through that you come to understand ultimate truths. Otherwise, there is no way to gain experience with the embodiment of truth, the Dharmakaya, because apart from the essence or nature of these phenomena, there is no essence or nature of the intrinsic mode, the embodiment of truth. The two co-emerge, and this is important. That is, this is a Mahamudra perspective on reality. That is, that appearance and reality co-emerge. There's no real difference between them. And so by experiencing thought construction as precisely freedom from all constructs, one experiences the embodiment of truth, the Dharmakaya, that is free from all conceptual constructs. In other words, this is the way you become a Buddha, by following this type of experience, by transcending any sort of agreement with or any sort of commitment to the conventional and experiencing reality as it is. So Gelugpa's mistake focusing on particular, I can't read my whole screen here. Did I think I went the wrong way? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so for Mika Dorje, you can't ultimately separate conventional reality and ultimate reality, because really, in a sense, all that we ever really have is conventional reality. And so the two, there's no, he refuses to make a fundamental distinction between the two. Conventional truths are ultimate truths, and ultimate truths are conventional truths from his point of view. So what does this mean in terms of practice? So positing emptiness as the absence of something other than the phenomena themselves detaches it from the very things that are conventionally empty. This is what the Gelugpa say. So they see this as, I'm sorry, no, this is what Daktsang says about the Gelugpas. So he says that if you, when Tsongkhapa talks about the ultimate truth or emptiness and conventional phenomena, he sees them as one entity in different isolates. That is, they're one thing, but they can be isolated. They can be separated by thought. That is, you can look at a table and you can look at it, the emptiness of a table, and you can separate that conceptually through your perceptions. But they're still ultimately the same thing. You can't separate them. You can't take away the emptiness from the table. So things are empty precisely what they appear to be, nothing more and nothing less. And from the point of view of Daktsang and the Karmapas, if you try to make the separation, the cognitive separation that Tsongkhapa does, you basically defang or you undermine the power of the ultimate truth. It's by experiencing ultimate emptiness that you come to understand ultimate reality, and that's how you become a Buddha. If you separate the two, if you treat them as different isolates, then you are undermining the power of emptiness to transform your perceptions. So a Madhyamika who experiences the Mahamudra insight into the nature of the mind and phenomena recognizes profound emptiness in everything. It is not strained to constructing a pseudo-reality of two separate truths. So the very idea of a Madhyamaka view is incoherent. It's something that needs to be experienced. You either experience it or you don't. Talking about it is basically a waste of your time. And so this is one of the things that sort of comes out at the end of all this, is that there's really no point in getting into all these arguments. And that's what both Wangchuck Dorje and Miki Dorje are saying, is that you'd be better off to engage in experience, to engage in practice, rather than trying to talk about these things and involve yourself in hair-splitting dialectics and systematizing. So, is this a claim? Miki Dorje, that is a sheepishly stupid way of thinking. That is that, our refusal to make a claim is a claim itself. Along these lines, a non-implicative negation, a megach, would turn out to be precisely an implicative negation. The lack of rainfall would itself imply rainfall, and so on and so forth. The hopes of the fools who present that type of objection will never be fulfilled. In other words, these are people who are just going around in circles. They're like hamsters on treadmills. They're never going to get anywhere as long as they continue to think in these foolish ways. The Madhyamaka's rejection of all claims follows from experience with the Madhyamaka path. And this is where it really comes down to, what it really comes down to for all these people involved in the non-Gelugpa side. It's all really about what you experience and how you experience it. And once you experience ultimate reality, you realize that all of this philosophizing, systematizing, and so forth is a waste of time. And more than a waste of time, it's really problematic in that it leads you away from correct experience, and it leads you away from the truth. So in other words, this is something that is positively detrimental to your religious progress. So the Madhyamaka only responds to others' errors, like the clear-eyed doctor who removes cataracts from the blind, but does not replace them with another delusion. One time, one of my teachers, Kensur Yeshe Tupten, had what I thought was one of the best analogies that I've ever seen for this. He said that a Buddha is like an adult playing with a child who has a toy horse. And so he says, the child's playing with the horse, and the horse's leg breaks off, and the child's really upset because the horse is suffering and so forth. And the adult knows that this isn't the case, that it's only a toy horse, but he knows what the child is thinking, what the child is saying. So he sort of gets some tape and he tapes the horse's leg together again, and he says, see, the horse is okay, the horse is happy again. But the adult knows what the child is thinking and is able to operate on the child's level, but without actually participating in the child's reality. He understands the child's reality. He understands what the child is perceiving, what the child is thinking, but is, as an adult, seeing things more clearly, doesn't actually participate in those same mistaken points of view. So this is what a Madhyamaka is, according to all these people. So ultimately, what we're talking about here, from a Mahamudra point of view, is meditation that focuses on directly experiencing the nature of mind. And the nature of mind is neither an object nor a subject. It's beyond all categories. And this is something that can only be known through direct experience. And only those who have that sort of experience are going to be able to understand what these people are saying. And that's that.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Powers. And we went dark.
Yes.
That was wonderful. Really, really wonderful. I think that when we look at Daktsang's points, obviously they're very highly intelligent points, because if they weren't, the fifth Dalai Lama wouldn't have gotten stirred up, and the Pension Lama and the Giant Sheba and Purpajok. If they weren't really, really good points that were being made, these folks, Giant Sheba wouldn't take a huge part of the Great Exposition of Tenets to make sure that someone whose views weren't really that prevalent at the time were kind of stomped on further, and with the use of kind of language that wasn't so nice. And Professor Hopkins even says in Maps of the Profound that he found that it wasn't really the best way to make an argument if you really wanted to be taken seriously.
He said that after a while he got really turned off by the nastiness of it.
Yeah, and Ngawang Pelben can even be worse, nastier at times.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And
but again, not particularly to the point. Daktsang makes the point several times. I'm speaking just as a Prasangika here. I'm not taking any position of my own. But what Jamya Sheba does is he accuses Daktsang of holding the opposite of every position that he refutes, which he's explicitly saying he doesn't do. So he accuses him of, I think it's 34 contradictions, but none of them are things that Daktsang would accept or did accept.
Yes, it's the straw man tactic that I remember Sidney Pilburn saying, that don't be so confident with, all of these negations of non-Buddhist systems and so forth, because a lot of times it's kind of a setup by the author and there's a deeper philosophy in there that they're not really choosing to bother with. So, yeah.
True, and it's often straw man positions. That's definitely what Jamya Sheba does. Now, that's one of the things that I like about Porchoke's text, is that he really does engage. I mean, he has some gratuitous slanging and so forth, but he really does engage with Daktsang's points, point by point. And he comes up with, I think, some very nuanced responses that I think do a very good job of rescuing the Gelugpa perspective on things. But if you want to find out about that, you'll have to read the books.
I'm very, very interested. I'm interested to know how, if conventional truth is just transactional and there isn't any way to validly establish it, if you say you need $10 from me and I give you $1, there shouldn't be a problem if there's no valid establishment, because that should be fine. In the world, the conventional world, if there isn't an agreed upon way to validly establish things. So what would Daktsang say about, okay, if it's just transactional, why, if you need $10, if I give you $1, isn't it enough?
Well, what Daktsang says, and I think that he's right about this, is that he takes what he calls an what we called, that is the group that did this book, we called ourselves the Yak Herds. So the Yak Herds came up with the term anthropological approach. That is, what a Prasangika Madhyamaka does, according to Daktsang, is she observes the world the way it works and can operate perfectly well within that. So, like, if I need $10 and you give me $1, I can say, where's the other 9? If I want to slake my thirst and I go to the sink and I pour a glass of water, because I've done this many times, I can do that. There's no reason why a Madhyamaka can't do this. But when you're talking as a Madhyamaka about conventional and ultimate reality, that's where things get different. Okay, so Tsongkhapa, what Daktsang is really talking about is the foundationalism implicit in Tsongkhapa's way of approaching conventional truths. That is, that you can have justifiable knowledge of things. Daktsang says, no, you can't. That doesn't mean that you can't operate within the world, but that when it gets to an ultimate level, to ultimate analysis, you can't ultimately have confidence in your understandings, because it's ultimately false.
So does he deny conventional analysis in terms of the ordinary world, in terms of conventional and ultimate analysis having two separate objects?
Well, it's all the same object. But he doesn't deny that we can make sense of our world or that we can operate effectively within it. So he's really talking about Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamaka in particular, and what a Prasangika can't say when operating as a Madhyamaka, not when you're trying to get a loan.
And my last question is I know that you said that there is a rejection, that there's a denial of something. But isn't there a denial of things existing separate, independently from a designating consciousness, no matter what, from Prasangika? Well, or how would this response be if there's...
Daktsang would say, we don't take any position. And Wangchu Dorje would say the same thing. That is, we have no thesis, just like Nagarjuna said.
So then the second turning of the wheel, the Buddha meant it, they would say. No eye, no ear, no nose. The Buddha meant it. So that would be, I see.
And they would say, we're taking the Buddha seriously. We're taking Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti seriously. They say this stuff over and over again. But ordinary people or bad philosophers are afraid by the implications. We're saying, no, they said this, we agree with it. And we're drawing out these implications.
Interesting. Okay, we have questions from the audience. Thank you so much for entertaining my questions. I have so many, many more because of, I know this is such an intelligent position. And for me, because a Tsongkhapa studier, it just sounds crazy. But then usually when something sounds crazy to me, it means it's doing something that I need to investigate further. So I really appreciate this, and I will definitely look into this text.
Well,
Would
again,
you
if you want to read a really good, nuanced response from the Gelugpas, Porchoak's text called "The Diamond Slivers" is the best of these. He also takes an anthropological approach. That is, that what Prasangika does is they describe the way knowledge acquisition and operation actually works. So they don't have to take any position on that, but they are able to see what works and what doesn't. The other thing that he says is that over the course of time, the things that work will be continued, and the things that don't work won't. So, for instance, people used to think that whales were fish, or that the sun revolved around the earth, and there was sort of apparently empirical evidence for this. Because fish live in water, they have fins and so forth, and you can see the sun coming up and so forth and going down. But now we know that these are both false. So better analysis, better information has led to the overturning of things that people believed for probably millions of years. So it's kind of hit or miss, and it may take time, but over the course of time, people will eventually work things out.
Would you recommend reading Maps of the Profound as a tool to actually understand the tenet systems, or is it unproductive and an unsatisfying read? This is the first question in terms of going back to Jayan Sheba and what we were just talking about.
Well, I would answer that in two ways. First of all, how much time do you have? It's a huge book. And how much patience do you have for hair-splitting doctrinal analysis? It's the sort of text that's really written for specialists, and particularly for Gelugpa specialists. So I think that most people would probably not find it all that edifying, because a lot of these things are internal debates among Gelugpas. And you would really have to have a lot of background in this and a lot of interest in it to really make sense of a lot of it and to really find it interesting. I did read the book. I read it through probably twice, all in all. And then I went through it again when we were working on this project. And I don't know, there's some good parts to it, but overall, to me, it's not all that profound. But that's me.
Honest, I appreciate that. Great. How do you relate to writers like Daktsang, who, with their praise of themselves, appear outright arrogant?
Well, that was a bit of a surprise when we got to that passage. It's near the end of the text. So it's a really long text. We only translated the Madhyamika chapter, which is still, I think, about 180 pages or so. So we were working through, and then we got to this part, and we thought, wow, this guy is really full of himself, isn't he? But from his perspective, he really did apparently believe that he got it right, and virtually everybody else had it wrong. So people who came after him, he probably would have agreed with Mika Dorje and Wangchuk Dorje. There were others who had somewhat similar perspectives to his, but in terms of the way he worked it out and the thoroughness of his critiques of Tsongkhapa, he really was right that at that time, there was nobody else who had been as thoroughgoing in exploring that way of following Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. So, I think that he certainly was correct that he had figured out something and it worked out consistently, the implications of it. I personally probably wouldn't have phrased things that way, but I do think that he was somewhat justified in saying that he had it right, because he certainly had a very compelling analysis of Tsongkhapa and the implications of his position. It was very un-Tibetan too. Like, you very seldom see Tibetans talking about themselves that way. That sort of grandiose self-praise. We were a bit shocked by it.
Is there a difference in in these two terms: conventional truth, conventional existence?
Well, to be conventional truth means that something exists conventionally. So there's sort of two ways of looking at basically the same thing. So something that is conventionally existent is conventional truth.
So then is ultimate truth a conventional existence? I think that's what they're getting at.
Well, when you get down to it, all we really ever have is the conventional. So when we understand ultimate truth, we understand the ultimate reality of the conventional truth. So there's really nothing beyond that, ultimately.
I love this, by the way. You mentioned that Purbajog's critique of Daktsang is the best among Gelugpa defenses. What's an example of his best argument?
Well, I really like the way that he nuances this idea of the anthropological approach of the Prasangikas. That is, that a Prasangika, operating as a Prasangika, can understand, can observe the way ordinary people engage with the world on a conventional level, and can see what works and what doesn't. But and can employ pramanas, that is, perception, inference, verbal testimony, and so forth, but without without accepting them as foundational. That is, simply using them as tools. So if I dig a hole, I don't need to have an ultimately existent shovel to do it. A conventionally existent shovel will do the job. And so a conventionally existent pramana, according to Purbajog, will do the job of making sense of the world and of sorting out what works and what doesn't. And again, over the course of time, the things that work will be verified, and the things that don't work will become apparent, and they'll be tossed aside.
We were talking about the round Earth. Was the Earth round if no one thought the Earth was round? We were speaking about that with Professor Guy Newland's talk. What is the difference between speaking of the world as like an illusion and speaking of it being an illusion?
That's a good point. And that is one of the things that was sort of going on behind the scenes in this, is that the Gelugpas consistently talk about things as being like an illusion. And that's important because for them, Tsongkhapa really wanted to maintain the reality of the conventional reality of the conventional. Daktsang and the Karmapas were not concerned with that. So for Tsongkhapa, building a system, creating a consistent system, that was really important for him. And so his work was really about building up the system from the ground up based on Buddhist principles. And in order to do that, he had to have things that you could rely on. And from the point of view of Daktsang and the Karmapas, that really isn't important. What's important ultimately is experience. Directly experiencing the nature of mind, as in Mahamudra practice. And all this other stuff is just like sort of foam on top of an ocean or something. It's really irrelevant. It passes away. It may be interesting to talk about, but if you focus on that, it gets in the way of actually experiencing reality as it is. But for Tsongkhapa, it's important that things be like an illusion rather than strictly an illusion, because if everything is only illusory, then you really can't talk about much of anything, which is, again, what Wangtuk Dorje is saying. So, but Tsongkhapa wants to be able to make claims, and he wants to be able to create an elaborate philosophical system. Like if you look at the Lam Rim Chenmo, this is a very elaborate philosophical construction. And if you take Wangtuk Dorje's point of view, this is all just a waste of your time.
Very interesting. I think that Jayan Sheba says that Daktsang is drinking mirages. I think that's the response that Jayan Sheba says in the text. And Gen Jeffrey said that I have to go eat my lunch that's like an illusion because an illusory lunch won't fill my stomach.
And that's, that would be, in a sense, what the two sides are thinking of. That is, if it's like an illusion, you can still eat your lunch. If it is an illusion, then you'll still be hungry.
Can Buddhists be brainwashed by being bombarded with the teachings of a particular lineage from a young age or the beginning of Dharma studies. For example, hold on, we got more coming in. For example, J. Mipam was very critical of Lama Tsongkhapa's object of negation, whereas I, as a dumb student, wonder how I can possibly realize emptiness if I do not know what I'm negating. So are we brainwashed by our traditions? And I guess, how can we know or not be?
Well, one of the problems here is the term brainwash, which has very negative connotations. We certainly, I mean, we're all operating within the perspective of what we've been taught and what we have decided is true. And for most people, that's strongly influenced by our background, by, where we were born, what society we were born into. It has a lot to do with the language we speak. Language has a very powerful structuring effect on our cognitions and how we perceive reality. And if you grow up in a particular school of philosophy or particular Buddhist school, there is generally a tendency to go along with that and to be strongly convinced of it. And when you read a lot of what I refer to this as school spirit. When you read a lot of Gelugpa materials, they're really about building up school spirit. So, they'll be telling young monks, well, you may have been born into a family that's always been Gelugpa. Your local monastery may be a Gelugpa monastery. So when you entered the order, you went into a Gelugpa monastery, but we're really the best order. We have it right. And, we have Jay Rinpoche and we have all these other guys who are really great. And so it may be sort of random that you got here, but you should really study hard because you're in the best order that has the best philosophy and the best stuff and the best teachers. And so, if they were to say, oh, well, Kagyupa's good, Sagyapa's fine, whatever, whatever floats your boat, it probably wouldn't help to inspire particularly young people to work hard and study hard. So this whole idea of school spirit is really important, I think, for getting people sort of ginned up so that they're, eager to practice and want to put in the effort that's necessary. Now, what I found, particularly among a lot of my teachers were Gelugpas, and one of the things that I found was that while a lot of the younger Gelugpas that I met, I spent a lot of time in India, and I would go to the debates like in Dharamsala and places like that, and there was really strong conviction among these, younger monks and even the older monks too. But I found that particularly the most senior people would often have a very different attitude. I remember one time Khenso Yeshe Thupten was giving a talk. He was the abbot of Loseling, the former abbot of Loseling. So he was, probably the lineage holder of the Loseling system. And one day at UVA, he gave a long talk on their system, looking at their textbook, their Yikcha, and drawing out the important points of the Yikcha. And he went on for about an hour or so, and he explained it in great detail, and it was very thorough and very erudite. And then he sort of took a deep breath and he said, but I think we're really wrong on a lot of things. And then he spent the next half hour basically trashing key elements of the Loseling system. So, and saying that the rivals, the Gomang people, actually had a better take on some of these things. And you see that particularly with some of the, with the more advanced people, with the older people who are, the really great ones are able to operate within the system, but also critique it effectively and to see both sides of the issue.
It's really true. At the end of his life, my teacher, Khenso Geshe Wandak Rinpoche, told me that Shakar Gen Nima said to him, and Khenso Rinpoche always taught Panchen Sonandrapa because he was the Loseling monk to me. He said to me, Shakar Gen Nima said that if you want, he asked Khenso Rinpoche what he was studying, and Khenso Rinpoche said Panchen Sonandrapa Tsongkhapa, and he said, if you want to open your wisdom eye, you're going to need Jayan Sheba. So then this was not something that you would normally hear from a Loseling monk, that, you're going to need someone else's textbook. So you're 100% right. As the minds open more and more and more, you see that you're just trying to get to the seeing emptiness, and whatever it's going to take, that's what it's going to take. And that's what's the most important, is the accurate information. Did Daktsang change
in Tibet for people to travel to different teachers and to get their perspectives? And often teachers would advise their students to go talk to somebody else.
Yes. Did Daktsang change his mind in relation to Tsongkhapa's view later in his life?
That's one of the interesting things that we talk about in the text. there is an undoubtedly spurious text that the Gelugpas often cite that's like sort of supposed to be a deathbed confession by Daktsang. He says, "Oh, I was so wrong to slander J. Rinpoche. May I, in all future lifetimes, be a devotee of J. Rinpoche, and may I make up for the terrible slanders that I've caused, that I've purported." And but we found at least 4 other texts just like this of opponents of Tsongkhapa that were supposedly deathbed confessions by his opponents, which makes it. And the other thing that's important about this is that there are collections of Daktsang's works, and this supposed deathbed confession doesn't appear in any of them. It only appears in Gelugpa libraries. So the Gelugpas all cite this as evidence that he recanted later on. But the fact that they say, "Oh, he recanted later on and he was ashamed of himself, but we're going to spend the next 30 pages refuting his ideas anyway." So, I mean, clearly, if they really did believe that he had recanted, that probably would have been the end of the matter for them. They probably wouldn't have bothered to devote all this time to refuting him again.
They could have just said, "See Daktsang's text."
Yeah.
Apology text for further information. Okay.
This appears to be a common technique or tactic of the Gelugpas to sort of make their enemy a convert to J. Rinpoche's system.
And this is the last question that I have. If practice is experiencing the nature of the mind, how do I get there? Do I sit and ask someone or something to bestow the experience? Or do I expect that experience of mind to bestow itself, that is, just happen? IOW, I never know what short things mean. In other words, without a position, how can there be practice?
Well, you don't need to have a position to practice. You need to have a goal, probably. So if your goal is to directly experience the nature of mind in, say, Mahamudra practice, then your best bet would be to find a Mahamudra master who can teach you the techniques of Mahamudra practice. One of the analogies that the Buddhists often use is that if you're stuck in a hole and you want to get out, there's no point in asking somebody else in the hole to help you. You need somebody who's outside the hole. And so one of the constants of Buddhist meditation theory and practice is that it's absolutely essential to find a teacher who is who has the experience themselves and also is skilled at teaching. So the Buddha, according to the stories, was able to figure it out on his own. Of course, he also had lifetimes of previous practice. But most people are not the Buddha, and so most of us need to have a teacher. And so, but what the Karmapas would say is that we need to have a teacher, but we don't need to have viewpoints. We don't need to have philosophical views in order to be able to practice effectively. Now, we do need to, I guess that they would probably agree that they, as Buddhists, do practice Buddhism, and they wore monastic robes and followed monastic tenets and so forth. But they wouldn't agree that ultimately these are ultimately real, that they're effective as long as they're effective. And so to the extent that they work, then you can engage in that practice. If they don't work, then you might try some other sort of practice.
More questions. Is it okay? Do you have a few more?
Yeah.
Okay, great. You mentioned that the two sides were using the same term, but ascribed different meanings to it. Why did they do that? Weren't they masters who were well learned and had great meditative realizations?
Good question. Well, one thing is that they weren't debating face to face. So you didn't have feedback. So, one person would write one of these texts, and then maybe 100 years later, there would be a response to it from somebody else. So, when Jamyang Sheba was discussing Daktsang, he was treating Daktsang's use of terminology like pramana, sema, in the same way that Gelugpas do. Or the conventional truth in the same way that Gelugpas doing, that one in particular. So, when Gelugpas talk about conventional truth, as I said, they're talking about something that is true on a conventional level. When Daktsang talks about it, he's talking about, well, we actually use 2 translations for this. We use conventional truth for the Gelugpa text, and we use relative truth for the for Daktsang and the Karmapas. And the reason for this is that it highlights the idea that it's relatively true. It's transactional truth, as opposed to something that's actually true. So, I was talking earlier about how the Gelugpas emphasize it being like an illusion, and the Daktsang and the Karmapas talk about really as being an illusion, and that's the big difference.
Both things make sense. Okay, last one, I promise. How can the Karmapa, I think Karmapa, say he doesn't accept karma, cause and effect, but still hold the Buddhist world view? And that'll be the last one. I'm putting my phone down.
That's a really good question, and it's a good way to end it. And it gets back to what we've been saying before. That is, I don't have to have an ultimately existent glass of water to get rid of my thirst. An ordinary conventional glass of water will do the job. And so what the Karmapa would say is that if it's good enough, it's good enough. That is, if it's effective, if you find that it does what you need it to do, then there's no problem following it. But if you're going to operate as a Madhyamika, you can't treat it as ultimately real or ultimately valid, because nothing will fulfill those criteria. But again, it can be good enough, and it can be good enough to get you to Buddhahood. And if it does that, then that's fine. And that's really all you ultimately need.
So last thing, so ultimately valid, like Tsongkhapa wouldn't say conventional truth is ultimately valid. So they would just say it's valid.
He'd say you can have confidence in it.
Yeah.
So you can have confidence in water's ability to quench your thirst.
Thank you very much, Professor Powers. I appreciate you so much. We all appreciate you so much, and all the work that you've done is just incredible. All the activities you do and have done to proliferate the Dharma that are just immense and have been really beneficial to so many. So thank you. Thank you for this talk. I think everyone really enjoyed it. I can see all the, the faces. Everybody's really been smiling and really into the talk. So thank you. Next week, Professor Craig Preston will be here with us to discuss getting into emptiness with Jayan Sheba. So we'll get to hear maybe some of the 37 responses from Jayan Sheba, because he definitely doesn't agree with Daktsang, but we
definitely not. Anyway, thank you very much for setting it up, and thanks to all of you for joining me. And interestingly, I'm as soon as I finish with this, I'm going to get in my car and go on a Mahamudra retreat for the next week.
Awesome. Oh, what a great send-off.
I'm going to do the other part of it, the experience aspect.
It's so wonderful that you're such a practitioner as well as a scholar. It makes all the difference. So thank you for your practice as well as your scholarship. Really, I mean it. So we're going to have an opportunity to put the Prasangika view under a microscope again next week and look at Jayan Sheba with Professor Craig Preston. So that should be fun. And don't forget, if you wish to make a donation to Uma Institute for Tibetan Studies, you'll find the link in the chat box. This directs you to the Abbey donation page, and make sure you put Hopkins series in the comments sections. And if you want to find the treasure trove, it's Uma, U-M-A Tibet, TIBET.org. And you can find so many different translations, and everything's free, and you can click on there and you can hear all about this fancy stuff we're talking about. So I really appreciate all of you. And thank you to Sravasti Abbey. I think I got it right every single time. Again, Jeffrey isn't yelling at me from somewhere about pronouncing Sanskrit with inflections. And we so thank you for hosting this, and thank you to everybody, Venerable Lamsala and Venerable Chunyi, everybody who's behind the scenes and everyone else behind the scenes making this happen. It's just such an awesome teaching. And we've been getting responses, or I have, from around the world, because I'm part of the Nalanda Masters program, and there's people in India and all over the place watching these, and people are happy and benefiting greatly. So thank you to everybody, the scholars, Professor John Powers, Sravasti Abbey. And now let's dedicate the immense amount of merit we've created from listening to this pure teaching. From the King of Prayers, I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri, and likewise Samantabhadra as well. With whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the three times, I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. Thanks a lot, everybody. See you next time.